the art of emotional invisibility between poison and the veil of power. There's a kind of pain you don't scream about, a kind of chaos that doesn't erupt. It quietly devours a man's heart from the inside out. It's not the pain of obvious loss or public trauma or tragedy shouted in headlines. It's the pain of feeling too much without knowing what to do with it. The weight of carrying emotions too big to contain, yet too trapped to release. This is the invisible burden many men bear, but few can name. And when pain has no name, it turns into hidden weakness, into constant distraction, into silent escape, into a fatigue that never leaves. Niccolò Machiavelli, one of the sharpest minds in the history of power, once said, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." He wasn't talking about cruelty, but presence. A presence that commands respect, even in silence. A presence that doesn't explain its emotions, because it transforms those emotions into posture, into clarity, into strategy. Machiavelli understood something many modern men still don't. Emotional mastery isn't a performance. It's an invisible art. A quiet refinement. A self-control that doesn't suppress. It redirects. He knew that a man who reacts emotionally gives away his power before the battle even begins. Because unchecked emotion, in the arena of power, becomes a weapon turned inward. In ancient Rome, historian Titus Livius described how entire crowds were manipulated through speeches that played on collective emotions. Fear, anger, the hunger for justice, all used as gears in a political machine. The people were stirred, deceived, then discarded. That emotional manipulation didn't die, it just changed shape. Today it spreads through feeds, headlines, and relationships. And the man who doesn't master his emotions becomes an emotional extension of others. He feels what the environment dictates. He reacts instead of choosing. And little by little, he loses command over himself. But here lies the paradox. A man too cold becomes emotionally exiled. A man too sensitive becomes a prisoner of his own fragility. Between these two extremes is what we call hidden presence. It's not apathy. It's not detachment. It's silent depth. It's knowing exactly what you feel and still choosing what to express. It's letting emotion mature inside until it neither wounds nor overflows, but refines. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of your emotional structure. We'll face the fear of feeling and the fear of not. We'll explore why so many men, even spiritually awakened ones, still sabotage their vibration, because they still react as if emotion is an emperor, not a counselor. You'll learn that silencing emotion isn't denial. It's allowing it to evolve before it reaches the world. Confusing emotional expression with authenticity. This video is for those who are tired of reacting, for those who want to stop swinging between emotional explosions and emotional shutdowns, for men who want to feel with dignity and decide with clarity. This is a video about inner power, about the kind of silence that heals, about emotional poison that, when refined, becomes wisdom, about a presence that doesn't need to scream or seek approval, just command. Because as Machiavelli once said, men in general judge more with their eyes than with their hands, and the man who governs what he feels commands respect, even in silence. There's a subtle mistake being made today, the idea that emotional expression equals authenticity. Modern culture often repeats, with warmth but little criticism, the belief that being authentic means showing everything you feel, speaking every wound, wearing your emotions on your sleeve, crying in public as if that proves depth. But what's visible isn't always what's real. Machiavelli, in his unsettling clarity, reminds us, men in general judge more with their eyes than with their hands. In simpler terms, the world reacts to appearances, not intentions. And the man who exposes everything he feels, believing it's a sign of integrity, often hands others the very weapons he hasn't learned to wield. Authenticity isn't emotional overshare. It's not unloading your inner world just to prove you're real. Raw emotion, when unrefined, becomes noise, not truth. There's a huge difference between feeling deeply and expressing indiscriminately, between living intensely and publicly unraveled. Culture of vulnerability forgot the aesthetics of power, forgot that some pain needs digestion before it deserves an audience, that some feelings, if shared without discernment, don't say, they just leave you exposed. And what's exposed without consciousness loses its power. This subtle mistake, thinking that being seen equals strength, is costing men dearly. Sensitive, deep, awakened men emotionally crying when they shouldn't, opening up to those who don't really listen, mistaking intensity for connection, and in doing so, they lose their presence. They lose direction, because the world isn't built to hold the raw weight of your emotion. It's built to respond to. And the man who shows his emotions without strategy will be shaped by the reactions of others. Feeling is sacred. Performing, sometimes, is survival. Machiavelli wasn't promoting cheap manipulation. He spoke of contextual intelligence, knowing when to reveal, when to withhold, and when to transfer. That's not being fake. That's mature self-restraint. The man who doesn't understand this keeps reacting, and ends up ruled by the external. True authenticity isn't measured by how loudly you express. It's found in how deeply you can sustain your truth, even in silence. It's the ability to feel everything, yet speak only what's necessary. To live through powerful emotions without using them as justification. To know that what is real doesn't need to be shouted, it needs to be lived. And sometimes, because there are feelings that, when handed to the world too raw, lose their sacred strength. And a man's sacred power lies in knowing what to show and what to guard like an invisible sword. How unfiltered emotion sabotage your manifestation frequency. There's a quiet illusion in the heart of every man seeking purpose. The belief that wanting something badly, visualizing it with faith and thinking positively is enough to align everything. But the universe doesn't respond to what you say. It responds to what you radiate. And what you radiate isn't driven by desire. It's dictated by your dominant emotional state. Spiritual neuroscience has revealed something many still avoid: the electromagnetic field of the heart, that silent communicator with the world, is deeply affected by the emotion. If you're constantly cycling through anxiety, frustration, fear, or urgency, that becomes your baseline frequency. And that's what attracts. Not the 2 minutes of positive thinking in the morning, but the unnoticed emotions that live inside you all day. Every intense emotion that goes undigested turns into an internal loop. The brain adapts to whatever becomes familiar. If your dominant state is discomfort, your nervous system organizes itself around it. It builds pattern addictions. It automates reactions. It normalizes vibrational states that block real manifestation. And the more you try to attract something new, the more you sabotage yourself, because your emotional field contradicts your desire. It's not about eliminating negative emotions. It's about not being ruled by them. This isn't about getting rid of negative emotions. It's about not letting them govern you. It's about learning to recognize, process, and then recalibrate your emotional field. Yes, this takes energetic discipline, but not the surface-level kind that says, just think positive. It's a deeper kind. The discipline to not let old emotions occupy the space meant for what you're trying to manifest. A man who doesn't filter what he feels ends up manifesting, without realizing, exactly what he wants to avoid. He attracts what vibrates between the lines of his emotional state. Manifestation is always but not always in your favor. That's why practical spirituality isn't just about intention. It's about vibrational cleansing, emotional integrity, the invisible coherence between what you feel, what you project, and what you sustain in silence. Because if your heart is vibrating desperation, the universe doesn't hear you, it hears your frequency. And the frequency never lies. The invisible poison of spiritual guilt. There's a kind of guilt that doesn't come from religion or morality. It's subtler and more dangerous. Spiritual guilt. It creeps into the man who is awakening, who seeks growth, who studies universal laws and tries to live in alignment. But when he slips emotionally, when he reacts, loses control, or fails to stay calm like he should, he doesn't just feel it. He punishes himself. Quietly. With thoughts like, I should be past this. I'm not supposed to feel this. This proves I'm still not enough. And just like that, spirituality becomes a corpse, and he becomes the defendant, guilty of being sensitive. This guilt doesn't scream. It wears the mask of self-awareness, of responsibility, of higher consciousness. But at its core, it's self-punishment disguised as growth. The man begins to see his emotional missteps not as part of the journey, but as proof of inner failure. So he stops learning from what he feels. He resists, suppresses, hides, and what's hidden distorts. It becomes a shadow, a vibrational toxin that poisons his manifestation. Spiritual guilt creates a deep incoherence between what you want to radiate and what you actually feel. He recites high-frequency mantras, but carries quiet shame for still being human. He says words like love, abundance, purpose, but they feel hollow because deep down, he feels like he's failed. And that dissonance breaks the magnetic pull of manifestation. It's not that he doesn't deserve to receive. It's that he self-sabotages by believing he has to be light all the time in order to be aligned. A mature spiritual field doesn't demand perfection. It demands honesty. There's no shame in feeling anger, fear, or sadness. The shame only comes when those emotions are seen as enemies instead of messengers. True spirituality welcomes dense emotions with both firmness and compassion, and integrates them, because what you don't integrate ends up silently ruling you. And the man who's always trying to look too evolved is often just trying to hide how much he still feels guilty for being human. The poison of spiritual guilt is dangerous precisely because it feels noble. But nothing born from the denial of the human can truly sustain the divine. You don't manifest more because you deny your pain. You manifest more when you honor your pain as part of your power, not to play the victim, but to free yourself from the impossible ideal of being an untouchable man. Because true spiritual power isn't born from purity, it's born from reconciliation with everything that still pulses inside you, even if it hurts, even if it's imperfect, even if it's profoundly human. Dope, the silent saboteur of inner stillness. Few realize that the biggest threat to emotional balance isn't trauma, or even the depth of what we feel. It's the unconscious habit of running from what we feel. And this escape doesn't usually happen through dramatic decisions. It happens in tiny clicks, in subtly programmed distractions, in quick rewards that numb the nervous system. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure and anticipation, has become the main hijacker of masculine presence. It addicts the nervous system to stimulus. It hooks the heart on euphoria. It traps the soul in constant motion, but without depth. Every time a discomforting emotion arises, anger, loneliness, shame, frustration, the impulse isn't to feel it, understand it, or integrate it. The impulse is to open a screen, grab a snack, scroll for a video, anything for a hit, anything for relief. But that immediate relief comes with a cost. It blocks the digestion of what's alive inside you, and undigested emotion becomes vibrational noise, silent instability, a fatigue you can't explain, inner confusion that won't resolve, only gets buried under more stimuli. The modern brain has been trained to avoid silence. Silence feels uncomfortable, because in silence, the truth shows up. And what appears in silence is usually what's been ignored for too long. That's why the more quick dopamine you consume, the less contact you have with your emotional reality. And the less emotional coherence you have, the weaker your manifestation. Clarity fades. Internal command dissolves. This is the silent loop that blocks spiritual maturity. Because as long as you're being rewarded for avoiding what you feel, you'll never build the emotional muscle needed to transmute what. Dopamine relief is deceptive. It promises to help you forget, but only buries deeper into your subconscious what you didn't want to face. Inner silence requires abstinence, not just from obvious addictions, but from invisible noise. It requires learning to stay, to breathe through the discomfort, to hear what hasn't yet been spoken inside. Too much dopamine erases the ritual of presence. And a man without presence becomes a slave to reaction. He doesn't decide, he responds. And a man who lives in response doesn't create, he repeats. Silencing emotions isn't about shutting down the body. It's about training the nervous system to stay, even when it hurts. It's reclaiming your right to feel without fleeing. It's regaining authority over where your attention rests. Because where your attention goes, your energy follows. And where your energy flows, your destiny either blooms or withers. Fixed point technique. Silencing internal emotional waves. Some emotions don't need explanation. They need containment. When a man is overtaken by a strong emotional wave, anger, anxiety, longing, or sorrow, the most common mistake is trying to overanalyze or react too quickly. But not every emotion wants to be explained. Some just want to be endured. And to endure, you need presence. Not the conceptual kind, the embodied kind. Presence in the body, in the moment, without needing a story. There's a silent practice drawn from Stoicism and deep somatic wisdom. The fixed point. When the emotional storm hits, choose one point in your body, your chest, your gut, your throat, wherever feels most vivid. Bring your attention to that point as if it were an altar, and breathe there, not to calm yourself, not to escape, but to hold, to stay, to anchor yourself as everything inside begins to shake. This technique isn't about solving the emotion. It's about not being swept away by it. It's about creating an inner axis that stays grounded even when everything else spins. The fixed point becomes an anchor, a vibrational center, a space of silent resistance. And in that silence, something shifts. The body learns it can survive emotion without being consumed by it. The nervous system learns that not every discomfort is danger, and the mind learns that it doesn't have to react on impulse By repeating this practice, a man cultivates a rare skill: emotional stability without becoming numb, intense presence without emotional leakage. His emotions no longer need to spill out to be processed. Instead, they move through him, transform, mature, until they become insight, direction, power. The fixed point is a small gesture, nearly invisible, but deeply impactful, because it teaches that true spirituality isn't what you say or believe, it's what you can hold when everything inside you shakes. The man who builds this inner silence becomes a contained guardian of his own energy. An emotional alchemy. Once emotion is alchemized, it no longer weakens you. It serves you. It builds you. It becomes part of a presence that commands respect without needing to raise its voice. It simply breathes. And it's felt. Beware the oversensitive spirituality. It weakens you in hostile environments. There's a dangerous idea subtly embedded in modern spirituality that the more sensitive you become, the more spiritually evolved you are. As if elevation means opening to everything, feeling everything, absorbing everything, as though sensitivity equals divine connection. But too much openness isn't evolution. It's vulnerability without discernment. And in hostile environments, a man who feels too much and filters too little becomes an easy target. He's not elevated, he's exposed. Niccolò Machiavelli never romanticized sensitivity. To him, unguarded emotion was strategic weakness. Emotion shown too openly invited manipulation. And while he spoke of politics, his insights apply just as sharply to the spiritual realm. Because the politics of energy are no less brutal than those of kingdom. In every domain, relationships, business, spirituality, forces are watching, testing, reacting. And if a man shows up emotionally unarmed, he doesn't inspire compassion, he invites domination. Where there's exposure without structure, there's a breach. And where there's a breach, power leaks. Mature spirituality isn't about emotional exposure. It's about vibrational discernment, knowing when to open and when to close, when to welcome and when to walk away, when to feel deeply and when to remain silent. A heart doesn't need to be available at all times to prove it's pure. Sometimes the cleanest heart is the one that knows exactly where not to spill. Sensitivity, without energetic structure, turns a man into an emotional sponge. He starts absorbing everything: the environment, other people's pain, the chaos around him. And slowly, he dissolves. He begins the day whole and ends it fragmented, tired, heavy, confused. He doesn't know why, but his body knows. His energy field knows. He carried emotions that weren't his because he thought that was compassion. It wasn't. It was a lack of filter. Hostile environments don't demand coldness. They demand precision. You don't need to become indifferent, but you do need to stop giving yourself away completely, as if that's what spiritual presence means. True elevation isn't absorbing everything. It's staying grounded when everything around you pulls at your edges. It's understanding that sensitivity without structure is waste, and compassion without limits becomes self-abandonment dressed as light. The mental model of the invisible prince. How to handle strong emotions in public. There's a type of strength that doesn't shout, but still commands. A presence that doesn't announce itself, yet imposes naturally. That strength is born from containment, not rigid repression, but strategic emotional intelligence. When a man feels something intense in public, his first battle isn't against the emotion. It's against the urge to react, against the need to prove he's okay, against the temptation to justify his state. In that very moment, it becomes clear: is he ruled by the emotion, or does he rule it? Machiavelli gives us a timeless principle. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by strategy. In the emotional realm, that strategy is invisible. It's the ability to observe yourself internally, even as the world watches externally. The invisible prince isn't a man who doesn't feel. He's the man who feels without being read. who holds what pulses within, without offering it up to be used against him. He doesn't isolate from emotion, but he doesn't expose it to every eye. Because in the arena of influence, even the smallest tremor can be interpreted as weakness. When a man is emotionally activated in public, every move matters, every silence, every glance, every hesitation. These details shape how the world perceives him. And that's why the invisible prince doesn't disappear. He transforms what he feels into posture, into silent strength, into perceptual stability. He doesn't need to explain what's happening. His containment speaks for him. He is present. He is whole. He will not be ruled from within, nor decoded from without. It's about allowing emotion to move internally, without turning it into external reaction. It's a discipline, a refinement, a path of relational alchemy. And the more it's practiced, the more people around you begin to sense it. They read you as grounded, trustworthy, centered, even if they can't explain why. That's the effect of vibrational containment, a power that doesn't speak with words, but with frequency. The man who embodies the invisible prince knows that feeling deeply is a privilege, but expressing indiscriminately is a risk. So he learns to turn emotion into a refined weapon, not to hurt, but to protect, to know exactly where to show and where to guard. Because the man who reveals everything all the time gives up the mystery. And in the emotional game of power, mystery is as valuable as mastery, maybe even more. What's unrevealed can't be manipulated. What's withheld stays intact, whole, potent, invisibly sovereign. Silencing emotion isn't denial. It's directional alchemy. There's a dangerous misconception among many awakened men that silencing what you feel equals denial. As if containment always meant repression. As if silence always led to illness. But silence isn't denial. Silence is refinement. It's redirection. It's turning what might explode into something that can build. When emotion is neither dramatized nor suppressed, it becomes raw material. Fuel, frequency that manifests. Lucretius, the poet-philosopher who inspired generations with his view of nature as a constant flux of invisible particles, said the universe is made of subtle motion. Nothing stands still. Nothing is fixed. Emotions are the same. Vibrational particles in motion. If you try to crush an emotion, it rebels. If you spill it into the world, it dissipates. But if you channel it, it transforms. It becomes creative energy, focused momentum, quiet power in motion. Channeling emotion is different from expressing it. Expression often comes with a rush, a discharge, a release. But relief isn't always transformation. It's sometimes just channeling is another art. It's feeling fully and choosing not to explode or escape, but to convert that energy into direction, into refined intent, into precision. It's turning anger into decisive action, turning sadness into steady compassion, turning fear into sharp analysis. A man who channels doesn't become cold. He becomes centered. He overflows inwardly. Because the universe doesn't just respond to what you want, it responds to what you consistently vibrate. And there's no greater consistency than that of a man who feels deeply, but doesn't get swept away. A man who turns pain into presence, emotion into density, feeling into vibrational posture. That man becomes magnetic. He attracts, not by what he says, but by what he holds. To be silent, then, is not to deny emotion. It's to allow the emotion to reach energetic maturity before it's released. To let it refine itself, to organize, to rise. Because raw emotion is still instinct, but channeled emotion becomes power, a tool of creation, an invisible art. And the man who learns this no longer feels the need to explain why he doesn't express everything. He knows he's building something higher, deeper, more real, from what once seemed like chaos. Silence becomes his language, a wordless prayer. A presence that reorganizes the field without needing to justify itself. Few will notice, but everyone will feel it. Vibrational purification, ritual, night writing for emotional transmutation. There's a time of day when the unconscious starts to speak louder. When the body slows down, the mind lowers its guard, and what's been suppressed begins to surface. At night, a man meets the emotions he spent all day avoiding, and in that quiet interval, between the end of doing and the beginning of sleep, lies the opportunity for vibrational purification. Writing, when done as a ritual, is not storytelling, it's alchemy. The simple act of writing what you felt, without decoration, without filters, without judgment, becomes a way to distill accumulated emotional energy. Through writing, a man isn't narrating his day, he's extracting poisons, giving form to what was previously internal noise. And once it has form, he gains power, because what you can name, you can stop from silently ruling your life. After writing, read your words as if they weren't yours. Read them like you're observing another man, with his fears, impulses, contradictions. That symbolic distance transforms weight into clarity. What was personal becomes a pattern. What was pain becomes data. Raw emotion becomes symbol. And a symbol can be worked with, transmuted, redefined. This nightly writing ritual doesn't require much time, only honesty. A pen, a page, a man willing to see himself with no filters and no judgment. Because the goal isn't to analyze, it's to release, not to explain, but to metabolize. Practiced consistently, this simple act begins to shift the base frequency of your energy field. You wake up lighter, clearer, more grounded in your decision, because emotional waste was quietly recycled, without drama, exposure, or escape. Vibrational purification isn't just done with baths, prayers, or crystals. It also happens in raw confrontation with your emotions, and the willingness to face, process, and convert. Because untransmuted emotion is heavy, but crossed emotion becomes implicit wisdom. The man who writes to purify isn't seeking answers. He's practicing sovereignty. He's saying to himself, "What I feel is real, but it won't run wild. It will be heard, then refined." And night after night he reclaims power over his inner field, not through noise, not through force, but with paper, silence, and presence. A presence that begins to reorganize everything the external world still tries to disturb. The fatal error of trying to eliminate negative emotions. There's a desperate urgency in how many men treat their emotions, especially the dense, dark, uncomfortable ones. Sadness must be gone quickly. Anger must dissolve. Fear must be ignored. And the result? A fragmented man, trying to eliminate essential parts of himself, as if fullness were a state where only light and beauty remain. But it's not. Real wholeness includes shadow, includes heaviness, includes everything the ego would hide. But the soul came here to integrate. Trying to purge negative emotions from your system is rooted in a distorted view of spirituality. The idea that evolution means becoming so pure you no longer. But Machiavelli would warn us. The man who denies his inner ferocity becomes predictable, controllable, vulnerable. Because any power denied doesn't disappear, it slips into the shadow. And the shadow, when not integrated, controls you from behind even your most spiritual gestures. What you try to erase comes back stronger. What you hide gets distorted. What you reject governs you in silence. True emotional transmutation doesn't begin with rejection. It begins with recognizing the symbolic value in every dense emotion. Anger might be guarding a violated boundary. Sadness might reveal unconscious loyalty to your past. Fear might signal a misunderstood desire. None of this should be destroyed. All of it should be decoded. The man who tries to rid himself of his heavy emotions is really running from his initiation. He wants the fruits of expansion, but rejects the path of descent. He wants the light, but avoids the plunge. And so he lives at the surface of himself. Affirmations, meditations, high-vibe techniques. All of it can become spiritual anesthesia if used to escape what must be faced with presence and courage. Spiritual maturity isn't the end of pain. It's the strength to hold it without collapsing. It's recognizing emotion as a raw but wise ally. Turning anger into fuel. Sadness into a bridge. Fear into an oracle. The man who tries to rid himself of negative emotion also gets rid of the depth that would make him magnetic, grounded, and respected. Because magnetism doesn't come from lightness alone, it comes from carrying density with silent nobility. Real presence isn't born from emotional purity. It comes from integrated complexity. From what was once dirty and became gold. From what once hurt and became structure. From what was shadow and became language. The man who understands this stops running. And when he stops running, the emotion stops chasing. It walks with him, as strength, as signal, as living memory of all he's crossed and all he can transmute without denying any part of himself. Inner coldness, as a higher form of spiritual presence. Silence isn't absence. Coldness isn't indifference. There's a kind of maturity that only arises when a man realizes he no longer needs to react to everything, no longer needs to prove his sensitivity to validate his depth, no longer needs to emote publicly to prove his humanity. True power doesn't explode. It stays calm, contains. It remains firm when everything else trembles. Machiavelli, with ruthless clarity, once said, "Men offend either through fear or hatred, but there's a third kind of man, the one who cannot be offended, who cannot be touched, who no longer offers himself to others for emotional reading. He is not numb, he is sovereign. His emotion isn't extinguished, it's educated, refined, alchemized. This man doesn't react, he reorganizes. He doesn't justify, he embodies. He doesn't seek external compassion, he sustains internal wholeness." Petrarch, in his struggle between soul's ascent and life's weight, captured the paradox of living lightly in a world that demands gravity. And that's where true spirituality lives. Not in escaping the human, but in integrating every part of what you feel, what you choose to silence, and what you opt to transmute. The soul doesn't expand through forced purity. It expands through reconciliation with what the ego once rejected as impure, inconvenient, or dark. The mature man doesn't seek to be understood. He seeks to be effective in his frequency, not to manipulate, but because he knows the world doesn't respect raw emotion. The world respects silent density. The world yields to a presence that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't contradict itself. And that presence is the product of deep, silent work, where every emotion is recognized, filtered, where every impulse is examined before becoming motion, where pain is no longer an excuse to retreat, but part of a legacy, vibrational and real. Silencing weakening emotions isn't a tactic. It's a path, a way of life, a personal philosophy, a sacred vow to no longer be pulled from within or manipulated from without. It's a spiritual refinement that doesn't require sweet words, but aligned action. That doesn't need outside approval, but quiet self-authority. Because true power doesn't speak loudly. It reveals itself in the silence of a man who no longer needs to be heard to be felt, who no longer needs to justify to be respected, who no longer needs to react to leave his mark. This is the man who doesn't disappear into emotion. He moves through it, listens to it, channels it, then walks forward, whole, invisible, imposing, like a subterranean river that doesn't scream, but reshapes everything in its path. And when he passes, even in silence, everyone feels it, because his presence is no longer made of words, but of the vibrational signature of a spirit that has learned to be quiet without fading, to feel without falling, to silence without surrendering, and to lead, finally, with soul and with cold fire.